Welcome to CSGuitars, the science of loud. The Boss HM-2 Heavy Metal, an infamously disgusting and repulsive distortion pedal nicknamed the Swedish chainsaw due to its prominent grinding usage in early Swedish death metal. The story of a relatively unsuccessful effects pedal which gained massive cult recognition due to its niche application is well documented, but what often isn't spoken about is what's going on inside this filth box on a circuit level to make it so uniquely well adapted for signal destruction. By popular demand, Boss have gone back to this 80s circuit and given it another shot, culminating in the HM-2W, part of the revered Waza line of reimagined effects. I couldn't be more excited to get inside this, find out what they've changed and improved, and see if it still stacks up to the raw aggression of the original. Let me level with you, I never expected this day to come. The HM2 has been discontinued since 1991, and one of its evolutionary successors, the MT2 Metal Zone, went on to have incredible commercial success, becoming one of Boss's best-selling pedals. Even during its 8 years of production, the HM2 was never particularly popular, and if it wasn't for bands like Entombed, Dismember and At the Gates pioneering the everything on 10 sound in the 90s, the HM2 could well have been a small, almost forgotten footnote in Boss's history. Yet due to an overwhelming surge of public support, I now hold in my hand the first prototype of the new Waza HM-2W, with standard mode faithfully recreating the sound of the original, and custom mode adding more gain and tailoring the EQ for even more aggression. This is a great day for 90s death metal fans. If you've never heard one of these before, let me give you a little taste.
The king, most feared from more than too long. A reproduction, journeys the ocean waves. Mountains in reptile home. London welcomes the colossal stranger. Double beam, Carnegie's beast, 80 feet imposing might. 100 years, the sentinel guards the street's gates.
Now you might be thinking, what the f*** is up with that sound? Well, let's break down the original circuit, which is standard mode in the new Waza, because it's actually kinda genius. Let's start with the gain structure. The HM2 uses pretty much every trick in the book when it comes to distortion generation. There are 4 main areas. This 2-stage transistor structure comes first. This is a very simple amplification process, taking the small input signal and massively increasing the gain. This isn't dissimilar to what you'd usually find inside a fuzz pedal, but the HM2 isn't applying that much amplification quite yet. Even so, this transistor stage is sufficient enough to start the distortion process. Next comes the op-amp with asymmetrical soft clipping diodes in the negative feedback network. This structure is practically identical to what you'll find inside another popular Boss pedal, the SD1 overdrive. This is just a standard overdrive gain stage which will produce softly rounded distortion with one half of the waveform clipping more than the other. A side note here that the distortion control is tied between the negative feedback network of this stage and the output of the previous transistor stage and has a twin application in this circuit. At lower settings, it's attenuating the output from the transistor stage, and at higher settings, it's dumping all of the negative feedback to ground, maximising the gain through the op-amp. A very clever setup, let down by the fact that the control does basically nothing over the majority of its sweep, only really kicking in at the last 25% at either extreme. Our third stage is a coring circuit, a couple of parallel germanium diodes in the signal line. This has 2 purposes. Firstly, to act as some kind of noise gate. Germanium diodes have an extremely low forward voltage, and when used in this arrangement will core out anything in the signal below 0.3 volts. Unlike a true gate though, this isn't shutting on and off based on some signal threshold. This is just cutting a section directly out of the middle of the signal at all times. While this gets rid of low-level noise, it also introduces crossover distortion, where the missing section of the waveform needs to stitch itself back together across the gap. Considering the amount of amplification going on prior to this, generating near vertical walls of the waveform at crossover, I would have assumed that this crossover distortion was having a minimal effect over the sound of the HM2, but the engineers in Japan set me right on this. They informed me that this was a critical part of the character of the HM2 and has been preserved for the Waza version, despite efforts being made elsewhere to significantly reduce the noise floor. The fourth stage is some good old-fashioned diodes tied to ground, forming standard hard clipping. This is what you'd find inside the Boss DS1 or a million other distortion pedals. The capacitor to ground which follows is attenuating high end, as there will be a lot of high frequency fizz accumulated due to the multi-stage distortion process. While each of these processes, taken individually, isn't anything special, when combining them together in this fashion they create a progression of signal gain and clipping which results in an asymmetric square wave distortion bordering on fuzz territory. But even with all of this, it's not the distortion that makes the HM2 iconic. It's the EQ section which turns this dirt box into a chainsaw. The face of the unit has two EQ controls, labelled colour mix, high and low. But dig beneath the surface and you'll find that these two controls are affecting three amplifying filters, each with a different frequency peak, all having a narrow Q and capable of boosting these frequencies by a staggering 20 decibels. The low control affects one filter which is centred around 80 to 90 Hz. It's no coincidence that this also happens to be right around the fundamental frequency of the low E string tuned to standard pitch on a guitar. This was designed to chug when the low control was cranked. The high control affects two filters which both sit right in the mid-range frequencies. One centred around 1 kHz and the other slightly higher at 1.3 kHz. These two peaks blend together into one wide mid-boost. When maxing out these controls, it creates a distinctive double-humped EQ shape which some have named the suspension bridge curve. By massively boosting the lowest frequencies a guitar can produce and the mid-range, while the space between the lower mids, which usually result in a muddy sound, are carved right out, an HM2 with EQ on 10 not only provides the ideal curve for cutting and chugging at the same time, but the massive gain increase from the EQ amplification adds further to the extreme distortion from the gain staging. It's this blistering level increase at specific frequencies that makes the HM2 sound. This mutilates our original waveform. We can see exactly how massive and unrecognisable from our input sine wave the signal becomes at these peak frequencies. Having analysed the circuit, it seems clear to me that when designing the original HM2, Boss never intended anyone to use it with the controls maxed out. The level control was clearly supposed to compensate for the strength of the EQ controls. The intention, I guess, was that the user was supposed to balance all these powerful aspects against one another for a more normal distortion sound, but one with excellent EQ characteristics and a unique gain structure. But the possibility was still there to turn everything to 10, which creates this perfect storm of chaos. A grinding, aggressive, churning sound with its curves in all the right places to cut through anything. And it's for those reasons I honestly believe the HM2 is the perfect distortion pedal. The Waza HM-2W makes a few important alterations to the original formula, and while Boss weren't exactly going to hand over the circuit diagram for this effect, they did tell me some of the things they have changed, allowing me to use my detective skills and guesswork to come to some sort of conclusion about what they've done inside this new pedal. While the standard mode is aiming to recapture as accurately as possible the sound of the original, the engineers in Japan took the progression of technology and playing environments of the last 3 decades into account and have upped the total output level by 3 decibels. While this would have been far too noisy for the original circuit, the Waza has no such issue getting louder. Alongside the updated buffers which allow the pedal to better interface with other units without signal degradation, improvements to the power supply section of the board have resulted in much less internal noise. This, combined with other efforts to modernise the circuit layout and more modern components, mean that the HM-2W has a much lower noise floor than before. It wouldn't be Waza if Boss didn't take the time to redesign a modern variant of the effect for their custom mode. This is where all the secrets are being kept. However, from reading between the lines, I assume the topology of the circuit is largely similar to standard mode. Multi-gain stage and a number of filters in the EQ section. They're not doing anything too drastically different and they're playing within the original rulebook. While custom mode increases the amount of gain available, it does keep that drastic distortion control interaction we previously discussed, but makes it more responsive. Finally, we can make more use of that distortion control. The sound itself is thicker and more homogeneous than the fizzier standard mode. The EQ, being the beating heart of the HM2, has been changed for the custom mode to give it a more aggressive sound, if you can believe such a thing. It's clear from listening to the device that there is a wider, more prominent low end, and there's a definite change to the mid-range characteristics, pushing its influence further up the spectrum. That might have been achieved by adding new filters to affect different frequency peaks, or simply by widening the queue of the existing ones. I can't say for certain, but what it sounds like is the low peak has extended down towards the lower frequencies, accommodating for down-tuned chugging, which is a popular application of this effect. In fact, let's confirm that on the scope. That's exactly what's happening. The low peak has been extended down towards the 60Hz region, exactly where the low B on a 7-string guitar is. This custom mode is making it easier to chug those down-tuned death metal riffs. We're still getting that low mid scoop, but the upper mids have been extended out towards the 3kHz region, exactly where a modern mids focus is for tight, djenty percussive playing. Custom mode is very much Boss taking on board how people are using this effect and tailoring it for a modern, down-tuned application. In my experience using custom mode, there's far more usability across the entire range of the controls, and this doesn't have to be everything on 10 to sound devastating. In fact, taking a more conventional approach to setting these controls yields a sound that wouldn't be out of place as a supporting rhythm tone on a death metal track. In comparison to the original effect, of which I'm very familiar, it becomes immediately apparent that the Waza is cleaner, more precise, and hits harder while still retaining that iconic sound. It's higher fidelity. If the original was standard definition, the Waza is Ultra 4K. The same picture, but crisper in its details without the distracting artifacts of 80s technology. If you made it all the way through this technical breakdown, then you should now have a better understanding of the HM-2W, why it sounds the way it sounds, and why this new Waza version improves upon the original in all the right ways. The high fidelity standard mode alone is worth checking this out for, but the versatility of custom mode brings this effect into the modern day and opens the doors for many applications beyond just 90s inspired death metal. I don't have a release date for this pedal yet. This one is one of the first prototypes that Boss sent to me so I could make this video, and I've been taking very good care of it, as I assume they'll want it back in perfect condition. When this is available, I'll be first in the queue to get one. I love it, and I can't wait to do more things with it. When it's out, I'll update the video description here to contain the product links. So if you don't see them there, it's not available yet. So thanks to Boss for this opportunity, thanks to you for watching, and don't forget to click all the buttons you're supposed to make this video viable to the ever-changing whims of the YouTube algorithm. That's all for now. Keep it loud, and stay safe. Right, okay, we got this.